Everybody, can you hear me well? Yes, because my presentation is consisting essentially in images, so you have to listen to me if you want to understand my speech. But first of all, let me thank our brilliant colleague and dear friend, Professor Brinkmann, and all his team for organizing once again this wonderful opportunity for all of us to meet and exchange our researches and thoughts and maybe find connections among us and our works. There are relatively few of us in the world looking at education through the lenses of phenomenology. So it's very important for me to have a place where we can join and meet and work together. So thank you very much. Malte is a member, among other things, of the advisory board of my journal, the Encyclopedia, a journal of phenomenology and education, which is an open access Scopus indexed journal, which was set up in Italy over 20 years ago. And the first director was Piero Bertolini. Maybe you have heard about him. He's the founder of Phenomenological pedagogy in Italy. And then Massimiliano Tarozzi. I think Massimiliano came here once in the past. At the international level, it is one of a tiny number of education journals with a phenomenological emphasis. So I invite you all to submit your work if you want, and we will be happy to seriously consider it for publication. So advertising is finished, and now we can get into the matter of the Congress. Please forgive me if I read my speech, but I've been traveling a lot in the last 15 years, always in Spanish-speaking countries in the world, so I'm much more used to speak Spanish than English, but I'll try to do my best. When I received the conference program and noticed that I was scheduled to speak at opening, I almost jumped out of my chair because I didn't expect it, and I was not told in advance. And so, well, it is a great honor for me to inaugurate your Congress, but at the same time, I feel all the responsibility that comes with that task. So I don't know if I am what you might call an expert in the conference theme, emotions and feelings and so on. But yes, I certainly have some direct experience. So I will try to make some considerations on the basis of my experience. About 15 years ago, in my university, the Catholic University of Milan, we set up a phenomenological group of research whose mission was to study the emotional life, especially with respect to developing emotional competences in education, healthcare, social work practitioners. And for 6 years, we ran a master's program in relationships and feeling in education and care professions, and targeting educators, teachers, but also medical doctors, nurses, social workers, speech therapists, and so on. People who worked with people, and in the course of their daily interpersonal experience, they felt the need to care for themselves and to develop their own emotional life as a resource for their work. And since then, we have worked in many different settings, from early childhood education to therapeutic communities, facilities for older adults, persons with disabilities, oncology departments, hospices, and palliative care units, even companies and complex organizations. And in all these highly diverse places, we have learned that there is a widespread and deep-rooted need for care and training and education in relation to the emotional life. And the cause of this need must perhaps be found in a paradigm, in a cultural paradigm that views emotions and feelings just as unessential and even dangerous, especially in the workplace. And this mistrust of emotion, which has relevant educational implications, is deeply rooted in our tradition. From Plato to Descartes, Western culture has pursued an ideal of an intellect that is free of interference from the emotions and capable of acquiring a kind of knowledge that is free, that is exact, impassive, and neutral. Within this disjunctive paradigm, knowing and feeling have traditionally been hierarchically ordered and framed as in opposition to one another. Sensibility has been considered, this is my group, I'm late. Sensibility has been considered the antagonist of reason. Passion and feeling have been finally associated with irrationality. Consequently, imagination, art, poetry, which are closely bound up with the emotional life, have been viewed as precarious and subjective forms of knowledge, while science and technology, being governed by logic, have been seen as unconditionally certain and objective, which is not completely true. And I tell you why. The emotional dimension of self, from this perspective, is reduced to a blind, unpredictable, and fallacious drive. We need to get rid of, or at least control and moderate our emotions if we are not to be perturbed by them or led astray by them. And indeed, the greater part of pedagogical and ascetic scholarship over the centuries has revolved around attempts to uproot or dominate passions, and vice versa. And this same tradition, educating the intellect and the will, mainly meant not attending to emotional life. Nevertheless, today we are much more aware of how much emotional states, for example moods, affect learning and cognitive and moral development. Some years ago, I came across a very interesting book by Nicolas Witkowski, a French physicist, entitled A Sentimental History of Science, which demonstrates, drawing on several examples, that as a matter of fact, scientific progress have always been bound up with the passions of the women and men who have achieved it. And in fact, if we were more aware of this deep connection of intellect and emotion, we could resolve the opposition between the two. We would be able to acknowledge the emotional life as the original source of knowledge. From this viewpoint, emotion and feelings would no longer be considered as the allogon, the irrational, a troubling dimension undermining our capacity for lucid thought and action, but rather they would be considered as the deep root, the primal stratum, and the necessary precondition underlying our thinking and acting. As Heidegger says here, man is not a rational creature who, in addition to thinking and willing, is equipped with feelings. Rather, the state of feeling is original, although in such a way that thinking and willing belong together with it. So thought and emotion, long held separate and in opposition to one another, are, so to speak, two sides of the same coin. Thought is never devoid of emotion, and emotion is itself a form of thought. I think that Jean-Paul Sartre maybe explained it better than anyone else in his sketch of a theory of emotions. It's like the famous bottle of Vanderberg. I don't know if you can remember it. A bottle which is different when I put it on the table waiting for a dear friend to visit me, and changes when he calls me to say he will not be able to come. Is it the same bottle or is it another bottle? Emotion transforms the reality, or better to say, it transforms our experience of reality, namely its meaning for us. So that the repression of the emotional life, in a certain sense, deprives our thought and actions of its lifeblood. Because as Maria Zambrano says, thinking is above all to decipher feelings, because feelings and meanings are strictly bound up one another. This denial of emotion has harmful consequences. It produces inauthenticity, impersonality, even dehumanization in the very places where humanity should be guarded and nurtured, like in education and care places, for example. And even when there have been efforts to rehabilitate and the emotional life, and to restore some kind of emotional education, very often we have only gone halfway, legitimizing some emotions at the expense of others, and suggesting that some positive emotions should be reinforced, but negative emotions should be eradicated. And I feel this is a very common misunderstanding of the concept of well-being that is promoted nowadays in schools, companies, and so on, hospitals. Is well-being the absence of the so-called negative emotions? I don't believe so. Splitting and polarizing the emotions in this way is misleading and even dangerous. First, because it prevents us from accepting and expressing unpleasant and bad emotions, making us forget that they too can fulfill a positive, a constructive role. For example, how could there ever be justice without anger or indignation? And second reason, because it makes it more difficult for us to recognize the dark side and potential degeneration of those feelings that we tend to unconditionally view as beautiful and good and positive. And this is a risk that is constantly present in educational relationships. For example, the affection of a parent can become possessiveness. Love can become overprotectiveness. Care can become dominance, and so on. These are the shadows of education that we must bring to light as phenomenologists. Now, I feel that phenomenology can help us to discover the essence of emotional life, but can also offer concrete insight into how we might form the emotional life and reform it when it is deformed. I will focus more on the first aspect because the second one would lead us into the field of psychopathology and so far beyond our purposes. The first point that phenomenology allows us to clarify is that although they are often confused, emotions and feelings are not the same thing. In fact, they are quite different phenomena. We distinguish between them primarily in terms of their depth and duration. While emotions are variations in mood that occur relatively suddenly and are usually fleeting, feelings are habitual patterns which usually develop more slowly but are more persistent. In light of this distinction, I would recall a very interesting observation made by Michel Lacroix, the French philosopher, in his book, The Cult of Emotion. Lacroix argues that in our times, the emotional life displays an evident imbalance. In our societies, we can see an emotionalism on the one hand and a sort of aphasia of feelings on the other. Today's intense quest for strong emotion is fulfilled in various ways. The spectacularization of violence, the rhetoric of hate, risk-taking behaviors, even the artificial induction of euphoria with psychotropic substances. The contemporary human person, says Lacroix, prefers shock emotion, which is of the order of the yell, to contemplation emotion, which is of the order of the sigh. In other words, our emotional lives have become more hectic, but also more superficial. Thus, we are all at risk of being over-aroused, emotionally over-aroused, and yet insensitive. The proliferation of the emotion is associated with a relative desiccation of feelings. The bulimia of strong sensations goes hand in hand with the anesthesia of feelings. Perhaps we are not merely looking at two concurrent phenomena. It is reasonable to assume that these two phenomena may be mutually related and that the excess of emotions serves to fill a vacuum of feelings. Or even that the growth of certain emotions causes the decreasing of certain feelings. It is very curious that for several weeks now, one of the top 10 hits with Italian teenagers is a song called Cherophobia, which literally means fear of happiness. To me, it seems in keeping with the concept I've just outlined. The song evokes an emotion, fear, which prevents from experiencing a feeling, happiness. And the fact that so many of our young people identify with this seems to me to be a signal that we should not overlook. For that matter, the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman taught us that it is precisely fear that today makes us all feel more insecure and vulnerable and prevents us from experiencing feelings of key importance for our societies, such as, for example, the feeling of solidarity, or more basically, the feeling of respect. If others, for example, become strangers to us, we perceive them as a threat under the dominance of the emotion of fear. And so the fear of those who are different to us will prevail over concern or care for those who are similar to us. And that's what is going on with migrant people currently, in my country at least. Fear prevails over sympathy, and the results are there for all to see. In this regard, I will display you this painting by Vincent van Gogh. It refers to a well-known parable from the Gospel of Luke, the Good Samaritan. It reminds us that the presence of the other calls us to responsibility, and that this fact is inextricably bound up with our capacity of feeling. For sure you remember the situation. A man traveling down from Jerusalem to Jericho encounters the robbers along the way, and they stole his clothes and belongings and abandoned him naked and wounded at the side of the road. A priest and a Levite who were traveling along the same way saw him but passed on. The Samaritan saw him and stopped and took care of him. Why? What led these characters to react so differently to this situation? The Gospel says that the Samaritan saw him and was moved to compassion. Now, this Greek term, compassion, is highly significant and indicates, in a certain sense, literally the perception of a profound belonging. The Samaritan feels the other person almost physically to be a part of himself. Without this feeling, he would never have acted to care for the man in trouble. This story tells us something that phenomenology has always recognized, that ethics has an emotional root. But what is most relevant to me here is something else, is that a sense of solidarity wins out over the emotion of fear. And this is important from a pedagogical viewpoint. Only being educated to recognize the other as other me can counteract our tendency to miscategorize the other as other than me. This question is of huge relevance nowadays in Europe and in the world at large, I think. But I would like to come back to Zygmunt Bauman, because during an interview in 2012, I think, he was asked about the secret of his long-lasting love story with his wife, the first wife, Janina, who was his partner for over 60 years. And the famous sociologist, who was then 87 years old, replied, "Love is not an object ready to use. It is entrusted to our care, needs constant commitment to be created, recreated, and resurrected every day." In contrast, we know that in our times, dominated by the market logic, bonds, even personal bonds, have been replaced by contacts or connections. Faces have been replaced by profiles. Emotions have become leverage like any other commercial goods. So extremely intense emotions are rapidly consumed and leave no trace behind them. It is still possible in this context to have lasting feelings? Bauman's answer to this question is summed up with in this statement: emotions pass, but feelings need to be cultivated. I would like to dwell for a moment on this principle because it seems to me to be rich with educational implications. It tells us that emotions necessarily flow, while feelings need to be able to take root. Given that emotions, properly speaking, are psychophysical reactions to the object of our experience, we normally cannot choose them. Hence, educating the emotions does not concern the emotion in themselves, but rather how we manage and how we express them, if we do. So we must learn to recognize, name, understand, and above all to communicate in appropriate way the emotions that we feel. And if we do this, they will pass. Otherwise, if we deny them or cannot find an outlet to express them, they will stagnate and eventually become toxic. So toxic or negative is not an emotion, but the way we manage it. So we urgently need to develop the ability to manage our emotions, of course, but from this point of view, I think that maybe the popularization of the concept of emotional intelligence has probably been positive because it has fostered emotional literacy or emotional awareness. And even Max Scheler, in his book on the idols of self-knowledge, says that the challenge in acquiring self-knowledge is overcoming the distance between experiencing something and being able to say what one has experienced. Today, our lack of an appropriate emotional lexicon reduces the communication of emotions to a limited set of simplified and even childish emoticons, no? That we can type on our smartphones, don't we? This inability to express and communicate emotions sometimes lead to uncontrolled acting out, not only in youngsters, even in adult people. In these cases, violence becomes a way of blowing off steam or dumping unprocessed emotion, such as anger, frustration, a sense of inferiority, or whatever. Learning to recognize and express emotions is therefore indispensable. But it is not enough in order to acquire an emotional, or better to say, an affective competence. We also and especially need to educate our feeling. And this is a completely different task. We cannot choose our emotion, but we are responsible of our feelings. Educating our feelings means deciding what feelings we want to cultivate and care for, and waiting patiently for them to grow, to flourish, and to bear fruit. We might say that, in a way, we are subjected to our emotions, but we are the subjects of our feelings. So affective education cannot be separated from moral education. And this means, as I see, that emotional education cannot be a merely psychological matter, but it is a spiritual matter. And I will try to explain this point of view. Thanks to Max Scheler, we have learned that emotions and feelings reveal the axiological plan of reality. They show us values, the value of things. Edith Stein says that our emotional lives simultaneously encompass a scale of inner states through which we experience ourselves and a variety of intentional acts through which we perceive values that transcend us. In this stratification of the emotional life, feelings represent the most intimate and profound level. They concern a person's heart, so to speak. But at the same time, they reveal to us the extent and the height of her world. That's to say, of the values that person has been in contact with. I would dare to claim that, paradoxically, the depth of our inner experience is directly proportional to the degree of transcendence that we can reach. In other words, our deepest feelings correspond to the highest values. Let's make an example. If I am in love with someone, maybe I will put his or her picture on my desk, sure? And when our love affair is gone, I will remove it. And it's a psychological reaction. I don't want to see it anymore because it causes pain to me. Or anger, I don't know. But if I lose somebody I love, maybe I will keep that picture on my desk in order to keep alive the relationship with that person, even if she or he is not physically present anymore. So it's a completely different thing, emotion and feeling. I can tolerate that emotion, pain, for the sake of a higher cause, love, because stronger than death is love. No? So emotions are a psychological phenomenon. Emotions, properly, according to Scherer, are in the psychic stratus, but feelings are rooted in our spiritual dimension. This appears to me to be a key point for pedagogy. Educating our feelings always involves deepening our spiritual life and broadening our field of experience. In other words, I think that feelings are the way of self-transcendence. I'm showing you this figure that you already know very well, because I wish you to note that although we conventionally call it the Maslow pyramid of needs, correct? Well, actually, it is not a pyramid. And it's not a pyramid because it is a two-dimensional figure. In fact, it is a triangle. But no one told us that something was missing there. This figure represents the psychophysical organism, but does not include our spiritual dimensions. Accordingly, it displays needs, but not values. Yet we know that what is specifically human exceeds this representation, because human being is not only a natural psychophysical organism. For example, according to this drawing, physiological needs are primary needs that precede all others because our physical survival depends on them. Nevertheless, a human being can decide to forgo them for a more important cause, for a superior aim or purpose. This is actually the meaning of a religious or political fasting, for example, or any other sacrifice. We don't have any need to make a sacrifice, but we have, for sure, values or good reason to do it. So this is the problem as I see. The so-called pyramid represents the individual and his strives, but not the person and her or him, his world. The world is not included, the world and its demands. Indeed, at the top of the so-called pyramid, we find nothing more than ourselves, self-actualization. As Malte told you, I'm currently the president of the Italian Society dedicated to Viktor Frankl, the famous psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps. Well, Professor Frankl didn't like much that figure, the pyramid, because the purpose of humans, in his view, is not actualizing themselves, but aiming to something beyond themselves. The essence of existence is self-transcendence. The more we transcend the self by focusing on ever higher values, the more our inner life develops at ever deeper levels. For this reason, we might say that a person's maturity is the maturity of their feeling, because the quality of our feeling determines our understanding of the world, and the quality of our presence in the world determines our perception of values and our actions according to them. It is through feelings that we grasp the very nature of things, and at the same time we perceive the affordances that they impose on us. For example, a fragile thing must be protected. A living being must be not treated as an inanimate object, and so on. In feeling, we come into contact with the world and at the same time with the deepest layers of our soul. And thanks to this interaction, we develop an inner hierarchy of axiological preferences, a kind of value system that makes us what we are and endows us with a sort of personal style, way of being. Scheler called this inner structure the ordo amoris, you remember it, which constitutes our personal, unique, and unrepeatable identity. So education means forming that ordo amoris. So much so that Scheler himself in 1925 called it Bildung. Bildung and the formation of the heart are the same thing. So the education of the art, to me, is the heart of education. This education of feeling is crucial not only to our individual destinies, but also to our collective destiny. 45 years ago, Richard Sennett, in his book The Fall of Public Man, warned us that our society was becoming intimist and alerted us to the possible consequences of this change, the end of public culture and the loss of civilization in our communities. Unfortunately, after a long time, we must admit that many of his predictions were right. We live in an era of individualism and increasing narcissism, in which the liberation of emotions is a way to try to be oneself and to live more authentically. But this response relies on an illusion, as we can see from the fact that our emotions are systematically manipulated and even instrumentalized by the television and the social media, the market and advertising, the politics and propaganda, and so on. There is no authentic existence without affective maturity. And affective maturity implies self-transcendence, because authenticity requires choice, and choice requires values. Since my time is already gone, I was thinking to speak about moods and atmospheres, but there are other people, I think, in these days, which are going to speak about that. Let me tell only the last thing about educators, given that it is impossible to speak about education without invoking those who make education, who provide it. Our affective, the only thing that can help a person to become a person is another person. But the extent to which others can help us to attain full personhood likely depends on the extent of their own personal growth. Karl Jaspers referred to the leading educators of humanity as decisive personalities. You remember? The greatness of Socrates or Confucius or Jesus lay in their uniqueness, but especially in their capacity to encourage others to achieve their own uniqueness. It may be useful to recall Scheller's theory of exemplarities. Exemplar, das Vorbild, says Scheller, does not teach, nor it is simply to be imitated. Rather, his function is to light up his disciples. This lighting up, Einschaltung was the word, is the essence of education. Exemplary person, says Scheller, should set us free, for example, and they set us free to the extent they themselves are not slaves but free. Similarly, a person who has not developed a broad and deep emotional life of their own will not be able to help another person to do the same. So I would like to finish with this. Good education always begins with a good education of the educators. And educators have often received an intellectual education, sometimes a methodological training, but almost never an affective education, except for their own biographical background, of course. So we need to offer them the opportunity to learn about and cultivate their ability to feel as a personal and professional resource. Because in education, what matters is not just what we know, but what we are. And the personal requirements are also professional requirements. I think that probably they are the most important of all. Thank you.